everyone, and welcome to An Otaku's Guide to Japanese History. Thank you all very much for coming out to see us today. This is our first time doing this panel since February 2020, so it is extra exciting, and we are so glad to be back. So, as I said, welcome. So anyway, so if you are like myself and Marianne here, I should introduce myself first. Hello, I'm Leanna. I will be your host number one today. My qualifications for this panel are that I have a degree in history that I do not use. I'm an accountant. Very exciting. And I have been an anime fan long enough to remember Crunchyroll is a pirate site. And when calling somebody a weeb was fighting words.
Yeah. My qualifications are I'm her friend, and I'm kidding. Well, partially. I'm not a history major, but I am a voice actor. If you watch No Guns Life, that's me. I'm Pepper. Also, Vanitas, I am this cat. He is the best boy. His name is Mur, and he is a gentleman. Anyway,
back to our intro. So if you are anything like myself and Marianne here, you will learn next to nothing about Japanese history in school. You know, maybe there was a tiny bit in the mid-1800s, and a little bit more around World War I, and then boom, we're fighting them in World War II. And that's pretty much all you get in terms of Japanese history. So maybe the first time you started watching a period piece Japanese anime, or played a video game, and there's some very angry men with swords who are very angry at other men with swords. And you're like, I don't understand why, but I'm just gonna roll with it, right? So if that is you, then this is the panel for you. We're here to tell you about everything. Or perhaps you do have some knowledge about Japanese history, and just would like to have a bit of more of a narrative to tie everything together. This panel is also for you.
Yeah. We apologize in advance for our limited Japanese. I'm on like 2 years of Duolingo, so...
Yeah, and so pardon our pronunciation of names and so forth. Obviously, we are not Japanese, and I think I took 2 semesters back in college a long time ago, pass-fail, so... So, as noted, this is a very high-speed crash course. We are covering somewhere around 12,000 years of history, about 1,300 of that in detail. So obviously we don't have time to linger on anything or delve into the details of things, so we're just going to speed along. Accordingly, we're also taking in order to organize this course, we're taking a very anime-centric view of things. As noted, anime is mostly concerned with men waving swords at each other, so that is what we are going to generally focus on. There was plenty of other cool and interesting stuff that happened, but we don't have time to cover it. Also, something else that got left on the cutting room floor is pretty much everything that has to do with women's history. Women were there. They were doing important things. However, men waving swords with each other.
That's what anime is about.
So I am literally not going to mention the name of a single woman after roughly the year 1000. I know, I apologize for this oversight. I am terribly sorry for it. So, yeah. Anyway, also because of the nature of this lecture here, we're going to be moving right along, so I would request that you hold any questions you have until the end. All right? All right, so let's get underway. So just kind of like how American history can be divided into different eras, and depending on which era you're in, you may have founding fathers rapping their feelings or future presidents slaying the undead. Japanese history can also be divided up into various eras, and we will use these eras as a framework for this course, kind of walk through them one by one. And the interesting thing is that we've been giving this lecture since 2018. So these eras are kind of, the earlier ones are based more on archaeological evidence. The middle ones are based on which family is supplying the shogun, and the more recent ones are who is emperor. So again, we've been doing this panel since 2018, and I've actually had to update this slide, because in April 2019, the emperor retired in favor of the new emperor, and thus the era changed, and there was updates. So, anyway, so let's get underway. So we begin with
early Japan. In the beginning, there was Doraemon.
All right, so start things off. We start off in the Jomon Period, which ran from roughly the end of the Ice Age to roughly 2,300 years ago. Anyway, forgot to mention here. This is chapter 1 here. Not a lot of anime take place in this kind of very old, tiny period, so we're just gonna shoot right along at warp speed.
Yep.
Okay, so Jomon Period. End of the Ice Age to 20,300 years ago, Japan was inhabited by mostly hunter-gatherers who lived on, shellfish, fish, gathered plants, and so forth. Nobody wrote about them. They didn't write about themselves. So pretty much all the evidence we have for them is archaeological.
Yep.
The era is named after the markings on their pottery. It's corded marking, Jomon meaning corded, on their pottery.
Yep, which is what the Pokemon ball toy was actually kind of based off of.
Yeah, got this little statue thing.
Yep. Cool. Oh, also the Breath of the Wild shrines, based on the architecture of the time as well.
Yeah, kind of that aesthetic. So they use Japan seems to use the Jomon aesthetic kind of as a kind of signifier for old things. So moving on, we get to the Yayoi Period, which was Japan's Iron Age. This era saw large-scale migration from elsewhere in Asia, who intermarried with the Jomon peoples to result in the ethnic Japanese. They brought with them cool things like agriculture and metallurgy, which led to a more stratified society as people started having jobs and differentiating themselves from each other. Also during this period, the Japanese were not yet writing about themselves, but other people wrote about them, namely the Chinese, which is how we know about one of the earliest figures you may see reference to anime, and that is Himiko of Yamatai, a shaman queen who was buried with 100 attendants.
She also was featured in the 2018 Tomb Raider as the person whose tomb was being raided.
So moving on from there, we get to the Kofun Period, 250 AD to 548 AD, or I guess I should use CE as more the nomenclature for today. The period was named after these large burial mounds that were raised during the period. Culturally, there was a lot of influence from China and Korea, and the era also saw the rise of the Yamato clan, or the Yamato court, which began as a loose confederation of clans and kind of turned into an actual functioning government with a bureaucracy and so forth. Kind of the beginning of kind of the first real nation of Japan. So before we go any further, we do have to talk about one important institution to Japan, and that is the Imperial House of the Emperor, or the Imperial House. That is the emperors of Japan. So the institution of the Imperial House is somewhere around, at minimum, around 1,500 years old, which is at which point archaeologists can say, yes, there was definitely some emperors, and yes, probably later emperors were descended from them, and which, according to the narrative in their native country, the institution is actually 2,600 years old, dating back to the end of the Jomon period. And either way, it makes the Imperial House of Japan the oldest extant royal family in the world, or that has ever existed. So between 1,500 and 2,600 years old, which is, if you know anything about history, dynasties don't typically last this long. It is extremely rare to have a dynasty that lasts even a few hundred years, much less well over a millennium. So the question is probably not how did the Imperial House of Japan last so long, but more why were they not ever overthrown? And no, there's a couple of different reasons. First of all, that the institution of the emperor is very important to the native Japanese religion of Shintoism. Up until end of World War II, the emperor was considered to be a living god. And so if you were at all religious, or you cared about the opinions of people who were religious, it was not a good idea to overthrow the living god who rules over you. Second reason is that there was simply no reason to overthrow the emperor or empress. There have been 8 or 9 empresses, but not in the last 1,000 years. But yeah, there's no reason to overthrow them, because the Japanese government worked perfectly well with somebody else ruling from the shadows. For the vast majority of Japanese history, probably and certainly the last 1,000 years, the emperor has basically been a figurehead, whether it's, and the government was actually controlled by another ruling family, or a shogun, or some other group of people. So,
like the British monarchy?
I was just about to say that. So it's kind of like the British monarchy, in modern era. So, technically, I think the Queen can probably, decide one day to wake up and declare war on France or
Today
whatever.
I declare war on France. Those frogs have mocked me for the last time.
Yeah, but if she ever did that, like, the British government would be like,
You what, mate?
yeah. So basically, what I want you to take away from the slide is if you ever, at any point, especially in the most recent thousand years of history, you're sitting there wondering, who is actually in charge? If your answer is not the emperor, you are probably correct. All right, so moving on, we get to the Asuka period, which saw the introduction of Buddhism to Japan. And also, the country underwent a name change.
Yep, the Japan was originally, it stopped calling itself with the Chinese name, which was Wa or Wo, which really meant something pretty submissive, like country of dwarves or country of short people, or even the country of submissive people. Needless to say, they were not so into that whole idea. So they instead became Nippon or Nihon, which is the origin of the sun, or as put poetically in English, the house or the land of the rising sun.
The era also still saw increasing Chinese influence on how they organized themselves politically. However, the Japanese tended to make their offices hereditary rather than based on examinations. So, yeah. And
Rule.
pardon?
So the idiot could rule.
Sometimes, yeah, definitely. That's a fair assessment.
Monarchy lasts so long because it's been noted throughout history that usually when rule is hereditary, it will fall within 10, 20, 30, 40 years.
We'll come back to that at a later date, but I would also like to request that we, keep the comments to a minimum so we can speed along. That's all right.
Shall be
Apologies.
explained.
Yeah, we'll get to the comments at the end if that's all right with you. All right, thank you. All right, so moving on, we get to the last slide here in our chapter 1, and that is the Nara period, in which the capital city was fixed to the city of Nara. Previously, it had basically moved around every time the emperor died, and it was a period of flourishing Buddhist art and temples, including a 53-foot tall copper Buddha statue, which I believe you can still visit today, that required 1 million pounds of copper, which is like the entire national output at the time for like multiple years. All right, which brings us to chapter 2, and the first chapter in which we will cover in detail, which is
The Heian Era.
the Heian Era. All right, so now we can finally slow down a little bit and talk about things in a little bit more detail. So, the Heian Era, running from 794 to 1185. The capital and imperial court were moved to the city of Heian-kyo, which is modern-day Kyoto, the so-called capital of peace and tranquility, and there it would remain for roughly 1,000 years. It was a period, kind of the classical era of Japanese literature. A lot of famous poems and stories were written during this period. Politically, the emperor was in charge. However, he was pretty much entirely controlled by the Fujiwara clan, a very prominent noble clan who very often married into the imperial family. Like, there were long stretches of time in which every emperor's mother was a Fujiwara, and their fathers-in-law would essentially rule as regent. Where did I go here? Oh, yeah, so I talk about, this is the era of classical literature and courtly manners and so things like that. Important thing to note, though, is, so you've heard the phrase, like, history is written by the victors, right? History is also written by anybody who wrote anything at all. And in a country where very large swaths of the population were illiterate, the only people who wrote things down were the people who were in the temples or were in the court. And who were, I'm not talking about, like, the 1%ers here in terms of wealth and nobility. I'm talking about the 1/10 of 1%ers. So everything I'm talking to you later about this, about what it was like in the court in Kyoto and culture and so forth, this is what the really, really friggin' rich people were up to, okay? This is not what the common peasants were up to. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're moving forward. But anime is mostly concerned with what these really rich people did in their spare time instead of buying yachts and things. Please hold your comments until the end, thank you. All right. So, Heian fashion, so you can recognize these people when you see them. So for men, it was much more, I guess, boxy than what you see in later time periods. Hats were very big. The hats with a little loop or a little tail in the back, those were kanmuri, and they were much more formal. You use them for going to court, you use them for religious ceremonies and so forth. The pointy hat there, that is niboshi. And if it was tall and pointy, you were of higher rank, and if you were of lower rank, it might be shorter or floppy. So, anyway, so for women, it was all about layers. They would wear these very thin silk robes, all different colors, and wear layers and layers and layers of them, and have them arranged precisely so at their sleeves and at their collars so everybody could see them.
Kind of like pop collars and polo shorts up years ago, you know. Is that classier?
Yeah, much classier. Silk polo. Gotcha. Anyway, so, and you could say a lot of different things about your colors. You could talk about, who you're politically close with. You could comment on the seasons, who your friends are, and so forth like that. So, very important. Hair was worn as long as possible. If it was dragged on the ground, congratulations, you're super fashionable. And I don't have an example here. Oh, also with the layers, the quote-unquote standard was 12. And if you were, say, like for the emperor or something, you might go as high as 40. So, you were very puffy. Anyway, so in terms of makeup, what was fashionable was to pick off or shave off your eyebrows, draw them really high up on your forehead, and then paint your face white. Now, the problem with painting your face white is it makes your teeth look really, really, really yellow. And so what is the solution for that? Do you bleach your teeth? Do you just never smile? The answer is that you paint your teeth black. I know, it's weird, and you never see examples of it in shows because it looks so bizarre to modern audiences, but tooth blackening was, the height of fashion for Japanese women all the way up until like the mid-1800s. And anyone want to hazard a guess on what they used to blacken their teeth?
Oh, Lord.
Orange there in the back. Or in the middle. The front. I guess you're the front.
Charcoal.
Charcoal? Any other guesses?
Tar.
A spike there.
Tar.
Tar? Tar? No? From the front?
No idea.
Ink or manure?
Ink or manure? No.
Oh, thank God.
The actual answer is vinegar, yum yum, and iron filings, which are great for the enamel.
Yeah. Things people do for fashion, right? All right. So moving on.
British are guilty of that too.
Yeah.
Alright, so moving on. So as I noted, the Heian era is noted for its poetry and literature and so forth like that. An usual thing though for medieval periods like this is that a lot of the surviving poetry and stories and so forth were actually written by women. Shocking. So the reason for this is that women were educated, again talking about noble women, were educated, however they were generally kept isolated from general society, they weren't allowed to participate in politics or law or a lot of aspects of religion. So a lot, and of course they're noble ladies, so they're not going to do housework. So basically they're bored out of their skulls. So they just wrote a lot to entertain each other. And so we are going to highlight two works written by women during this period that are of great import to Japanese literature, the body of Japanese literature. The first being the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon, which is kind of like a diary. It was full of bits of poetry, stories about what happened to her day to day, and for our purposes, listicles. She was.
So we have here an example from the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon.
So just imagine like an internet banner.
Right. Things that people despise.
Yes.
The north side of a house. Someone with an excessive reputation for goodness. An old man who has lived to be too old. A frivolous woman. And a mud wall that has started to crumble.
Yes, there you go. What is it? 5 things that people despise.
Apparently.
Oh, nobody wants a friendly wall.
Right?
I don't know, according to Sei
I
Shonagon.
just hate those north sides of houses.
Yeah, they're terrible. Yeah, south side all the way.
Old men that live too long.
Alright, so the other work I would like to highlight is The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. The Tale of Genji is either the oldest or one of the oldest novels ever written in the entire world. It tells the tale of Hikaru Genji. If you went to high school in Japan, there was pretty much, undoubtedly, you would have read part of the Tale of Genji. It's just that important. But anyway, it tells the tale of Hikaru Genji, the son of the emperor, who is very pretty and very good at everything. And he sleeps with a lot of women. And the reference you probably most need to get is that at one point or other, he adopts a 10-year-old girl called Murasaki, and later when he decides that, when she's older, he decides that she's the love of his life, and he marries her. I think they have a kid, I can't remember. But anyway, at some point she dies, and then he's very sad. A lot of other things happen. He goes into exile for a while, then he dies, and follows his son for a while, and the whole thing is like 1,000 pages long, 400 plus characters, and then it's kind of ends in mid-sentence. There you go, the world's first novel. And let's see, where was I? I forgot to mention. So Murasaki he adopts Murasaki incidentally because she resembles his lover, who happens to be his stepmother, whom his father married because she resembles Genji's mother. So unpack all of that as you will.
Yeah. And now you may have noticed that the character's name is Murasaki, and so is the author. Is this the first example of a self-insert character? Well, not exactly. Thanks to patriarchy, women's names were often erased from history or just not written down at all. And so the author has been nicknamed after this character because we don't know what her actual name was. And Sei Sonagon happens to be also a nickname for the other female author because we don't know her real name either.
Yep.
Also, apparently, the two hated each other, and
They lived
so
at the same
did their
time.
fans.
Yeah.
So this may be the OG fandom wars as well.
And also there was like people were really into this Tale of Genji when it came out. Like there's actually like a surviving excerpt from some diary of some random Japanese noblewoman who's complaining that she's only been able to read part of it, and one day she wants to go to the capital so she can read the whole thing. So everyone was out there like going like, man, I wish this story would update or whatever. Like imagine there's one novel in the world, one, and you can't read it because you're not in the right place. So with that, it now leads us to a fun little game here, and that is our Heian Era Poetry Jam. So I need 3 volunteers from the audience. Purple, you with the braids, and anybody else? We'll go with Spike. Cool. Come on. Come on.
Alrighty, so come on up. Is that icon? Or canopy?
So the background of this is that poetry contests were very popular in forms of entertainment in the court of Kyoto. And that people would compete to write the best poems and read the best poems. And that's what you did apparently on Friday night.
Right.
Instead of coming to an anime convention and sitting in and watching
Read poetry, which that's pretty rad. Cool. So an example of one of these. Oh yeah. Okay.
So we have here some English translations of some actual Heian era poetry. I specifically picked ones with no place names or anything, so you can all pronounce it. And we are going to compete to see who can read this the best.
Okay.
And there's prizes.
Oh yeah, there are prizes.
There are prizes.
We got some candy and some Pocky. That's quite exciting.
Pocky to the grand prize winner.
Okay.
All right, and the audience here, y'all are gonna vote. All right, so listen closely.
Cool. So here's an example. Don't vote for me. Like the warder's fires at the Imperial gateway kept, burning through the night, through the day in ashes dulled, is the love aglow in me. So give us your best dramatic reading.
Yeah, by the way, like the aesthetic of the time was kind of like the intransience of life and so forth. Like think like teenager angst, like turn up to the max.
All right, so we've got a mic here in the center. If you guys will each take turns, and whoever wants to go first.
All right, so contestant number 1.
All right.
Should they turn the mic around so they face us?
Yeah, if you or you can take it out of the
Yeah, it's kind of tall.
Sorry.
Okay, this is by Bunya no Yasuhide. Since 'tis by its breath, autumn's leaves of grass and trees riven are and waste, men may to the mountain wind fitly given the name the wild.
Probably easier if you just hold it.
All right, contestant number 2.
This is by Koko Tenno. It is for thy sake that I seek the fields in spring, gathering green herbs while my garments' hanging sleeves are falling, snow beflecked.
All right, contestant number 3.
This is, oh gosh, that's too loud. This is by Mibu no Tatami. Like the morning moon, cold, unpitying was my love. Since the parting hour, nothing I dislike so much as the breaking light of day.
Okay, so now it's voting time. We're gonna go through the list and we're gonna cheer loudest for the people that we think are the most awesome. You're all awesome. Okay, so number 1. Number 2. And number 3. Okay, well, to me that sounded like we got a couple of winners here. So number 1, I think you won our grand prize. That was a lot.
Congratulations, you won the Heian Era Poetry Jam.
Cool. Number 3, I think, oh yeah, I'll take this back, thank you.
Or you can keep them too if you want.
Yeah, if you want.
As a souvenir.
You want to keep it? You can. You can totally keep it. It's a souvenir. Cool. So number 3, I think you got second place. And then last but certainly not least, here you go. And you get a little prize there too. Thank you.
So, what they were reading from was the Ogura Hyakunin Isshu, which is a collection of 100 waka poems by 100 different authors. It was compiled by Fujiwara no Teika and is the basis for the Utagarata or Karata card deck. If you've ever seen Chahayu Furu, this is what they were playing or reading from. And also credit where credit is due, that is the 1917 Macaulay translation. I did not translate those. As we are going through these, we're also going to be giving some anime recommendations to y'all, to kind of like an anime that represents the time period, not necessarily historically accurate, but still just an anime we think is enjoyable that is set during the period. And our anime recommendation for the Heian era is the anime Utakoi, which came out in 2012. It is kind of like more like a series of like short romances, maybe an episode to a half an episode in length, each one based on one of these waka poems. It is a wonderful story if you like romances where the characters actually get together, and I think almost all of them are adults. And it is absolutely gorgeous, beautiful music. Unfortunately, ever since creating this presentation, there has been licensing shuffles, and this apparently has dropped off streaming, so we'll update this next time, but you'll have to find it
Elsewhere.
Somewhere.
Buy the DVD.
There is no DVD.
What?
But, so, somewhere.
Okay.
Also, we have up here, I have created little handy guides for all the anime recommendations we have. So afterwards, if you would like to come, and so you don't have to write things down, we have a little listy thing. Also, it shows where you can stream these and everything. So, anyway, moving on. So, beyond Kyoto's court. So, as I said before, I'm an accountant, which means there's some things that I enjoy very much, and some things I don't, but a lot of things that I enjoy that a lot of people don't enjoy. So I get to talk to you here because now you're a captive audience, and so the thing I get to talk to you about is tax policy. I know. Flee while you can, I see you in the back. So, medieval Japanese tax policy. So the thing you've got to know about old-timey Japanese tax policy is that only the peasants were taxed, right? Life sucks being peasants. There was a saying that was used about Japanese peasants. I know it was used later. I'm not sure it was used during this era. But peasants are like oil seeds. The more you squeeze, the more you get. Obviously, it very much sucked being a peasant. As for the nobility and the temples and so forth, they had carved out themselves nice little tax exemptions where, they didn't have to pay any taxes. Life's pretty sweet. So if you're a peasant, this is really terrible. So what you're going to do when you finally had it up to here is that you're going to go up to your local lord and you're going to say, hey, local lord, I would like to give you my land, and I will agree to work this land. In return, I don't have to pay taxes because now my land belongs to you and you don't have to pay taxes. And the local lord is like, yes, more income, more peasants to boss around, more money for me. And meanwhile, the central government is like, no, we have no income. So basically tax revenues tail off because nobody's paying their taxes anymore. And so like all governments, they got to start cutting, they can't exactly go into debt because it's back in the old-timey days. So they got to start cutting government services. And this being a medieval government, the services they got to cut are like basic law and order. So there's kind of this massive increase in pirates and bandits and so forth like that. And of course the lords don't particularly like pirates and bandits either, so they start, amassing their own private armies to defend their lands. Lands that, armies that include warriors called samurai. And slowly, this kind of balance between the court and the outlying areas starts kind of tipping, where the court is getting poorer and poorer and militarily weaker, and meanwhile the lords are getting wealthier and wealthier and militarily stronger. And you can imagine that at some point something's gotta break. Make sure I'm not skipping anything here. There's also problems with, there's some bad famines and so forth like that. And we eventually come to the end of the era of peace, which is the Genpei War from 1180 to 1185. It was forgot to mention also the Fuji War, lost power, nobody knew how to rule anything anymore, economies collapsed, bad stuff, it's all bad. Anyway, so we get to a conflict between the Taira and the Minamoto clans, which are samurai clans, over control of the imperial court. The Taira are ahead for a long time, but then the Minamoto eventually emerge victorious, and Minamoto no Yoritomo becomes the shogun. Which brings us to
Chapter 3, The Age of Samurai.
the Age of Samurai. So first you may be asking yourself, what the hell is a shogun? It is the short form of Sei Taishogun, the barbarian, subduing generalissimo. They were the military dictators of Japan, samurai leaders of Japan. They were, in theory, appointed by the emperor. However, as I noted in my other slide, it was a hereditary office. They appointed themselves, and just kind of rubber stamped by the emperor instead. The form of government became known as a bakufu, a tent government, kind of these overlapping layers of authority of who is actually in charge of whom. An analogy in English would kind of be like a power behind the thrones government, that in theory this person is in charge, but really it's the person behind them, but really it's the person behind them, or no, it's actually the person behind them. And these overlapping layers of authority, which could include the shogun or someone higher than the shogun, got very confusing. At one point or other, you might have actually had an emperor, an ex-emperor, an imperial regent, a dictator, a shogun, a regent to the shogun, and a retired regent to the shogun. Which of these guys is in charge?
All of them.
It's probably actually the retired regent to the shogun. So it's just kind of they know who's boss, but it's not clear on paper if you just happen to glance at it. But yeah, so it's just this overlapping, essentially just think of overlapping layers of authority here. So moving on here, we get to the Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333. The capital was moved to Kamakura. The Minamoto pretty quickly lost political influence, and it was controlled by the Hojo clan. Regents, more layers of authority here. The local lords continued to amass power, and the economy became very land-based in terms of if you control land, you have more money, you have more resources, therefore you have a stronger military presence. It's kind of more of a feudalistic society with lords reporting to other lords and so forth like that. This period also saw the Mongol invasion of Japan, and I think it's kind of left out of the history books a lot, but the Mongol Empire was the largest land empire to ever exist in the history of the world. They ruled from Eastern Europe to Vietnam. And in this period, they decided that they were going to invade Japan. They sent a massive invasion force to the island, and it was conveniently sunk by a typhoon. And then they sent a larger force to Japan, 4,000 ships with around 150,000 enemies. And then it was also sunk in a typhoon. The typhoons became known as kamikaze, the divine wind, which saved Japan. However, this failed invasion did have an effect politically, in that it was preparing to defend the country was extremely expensive. And it resulted in basically nothing because no new lands were conquered. And so therefore the lords could not reward their own warriors with, the typical thing was they would reward their own warriors with land. Like, congratulations, you won this battle, these lands are now yours. So there was nothing to redistribute. And so it was just very expensive, and the central government looked really bad, and it kind of became impoverished and started falling apart, which led to the next, gotta skip there. Talk about samurai. Sorry, a little bit disjointed here, we're a bit rusty. So, talked before about samurai, who began to become the warrior class here. So it's important to note here, when I'm talking about samurai, that there are two different eras of samurai. There are these early samurai, and there are their later samurai after about the year 1600. These earlier samurai were kind of defined by what they did. Later samurai are kind of defined by who they were. Earlier samurai, like, they served their lords. They were warriors. They were usually landed. If they did well in their service of their lord, they were rewarded with more lands. Later samurai were more of a social class. It was a hereditary sort of thing. Most of them were not landed, and so forth like that. So I'm talking about early samurai being something completely different. We will revisit this later and talk about the reasons behind that, but just remember that there are two separate eras of samurai. Also, just kind of one of those things to note, though, earlier versus later. So later samurai are very much defined by their swords. Earlier samurai used whatever was more convenient for them. So they would use swords, but they also often used, pikes and spears. Polearms were just very important. Bows, and even, and later in the 1500s, guns.
A lot less metal, a lot easier to produce.
Yeah, so normalized samurai with guns. It was actually a pretty common thing. So moving on. So next we get to the Muromachi. So after the fall of the previous shogunate, we get to the Muromachi period with the Ashikaga shoguns ruling from the Muromachi period area in Kyoto. This era also saw the rise of the daimyo. The local lords became more and more and more and more powerful and controlled even larger swaths of territory. This era also saw the beginnings of European contact with the arrival of the Portuguese in 1542, which is notable because they brought with them guns. The era ends with and then of course midway through in 1467 we get the Onin War, which you completely don't need to know about other than that it was a control over who got to do the ruling, and suddenly all the daimyo, these powerful lords, realized that the central government is pretty much nothing right now, and you know what? It's time for everybody to start fighting everybody else, because they realize that you can take what you want, you can have what you want, and the only thing to stop you is the size of your army, the size of your neighbor's army, and the extent of your own ambition. So it is time for a period of civil war, y'all, where everyone is trying to take everything, and that, folks, is our next chapter.
Chapter 4, the Sengoku.
The Sengoku Jidai. So the Sengoku Jidai, this is Japan's Game of Thrones period, where everybody's fighting everybody. It's a power struggle between the daimyo for control of Japan. Sengoku Jidai is the age of warring states. And pretty much everything you can imagine, like, in a good story is here. We've got conquests, alliances, betrayals, strategic marriages, just crazy cool things happening. And it finally concludes with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate. So, anime loves the Sengoku. So there are so many series that are set in the Sengoku period. There are so many that there are ones that are even really, really friggin' weird. For instance, here we have Sengoku Nightblood, in which the various historical figures are all werewolves and vampires.
Sure.
We have Nobunaga the Fool there in the middle, in which they hang out with Joan of Arc on another planet, and there's mecha.
Sure.
Just roll with it. And then there's I think the last one on there is Oda Cinnamon Nobunaga, in which the warlords are reincarnated as dogs in modern Japan. So there's even there's even a entire subgenre where the warlords of the Sengoku are turned into cute and/or hot girls. There are probably way more than this. This is like 10 seconds worth of me Googling. Sengoku. So obviously way too much happened during this 150-year-long civil war for us to cover in detail. So instead we are going to highlight a number of historical figures that you may see referenced in shows and so forth. So basically when you see them you go like, oh yeah, that guy. So first up we get, and Marianne here is going to give us fun facts about Sengoku warlords.
Hooray!
The first up we get Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, who was known for his cavalry, he's a daimyo, he was known for his cavalry tactics and was an able administrator.
When he was about 20, he deposed and exiled his own father when his father attempted to name one of his other brothers as the clan heir. And while he may have been a Buddhist priest and a vegetarian, that didn't stop him from sometimes sentencing people to be boiled alive.
Made people soup and didn't eat it. Pardon?
Sorry, I remember reading some stuff on Japanese history. That was the introduction of the Goemon style punishment, wasn't it?
I'm not aware. But anyway, so I got a map up there of which their territories were. So next up we have Uesugi Kenshin, the god of war, the dragon of Echigo, who was also a shrewd tactician and had a rivalry with Takeda Shingen.
He had this like epic anime style, like
Shonen
respect,
battle.
shonen, hate anime, like
Hate, love your opponents. Yeah.
like rivalry with Shingen. They fought a lot of times, and it is very likely they actually fought each other personally one-on-one, which almost never, ever happened. According to legend, Kenshin burst into Shingen's camp on horseback and attacked him with a sword, but then Shingen countered Kenshin's strike with a sweep of his iron war fence, which is pretty epic, and I ship it.
But yeah, it's just like so weird that they actually personally fought each other. Like, it's so bizarre in history. Like, it's like if you're playing chess and your kings put each other in check, you're like, that's not supposed to happen? Yeah, anyway. So next up we have Sanada Yukimura, who is not a daimyo, he served daimyo, he was a little bit lesser rank. He bounced around to serving various daimyo, and he's often depicted as using a spear.
So, fun facts on him. His actual name was Sanada no Yoshige. He never actually went by Yukimura at any point in his life. Yukimura was made up by an author in the Edo era, and that's what he's remembered as. Also, he died at the very epilogue of the Sengoku period, the siege of Osaka Castle, sat down in his camp, took his helmet off, and was so exhausted that he fell to an enemy attacking forces with little resistance. It was like just a big mood.
Gave up. So basically, he was also like dying on the last page of your novel. It's just like, really, you made it that far, and then you just kind of.
He was just done.
Yeah, he died.
Senioritis.
All right. All right. So if you notice, they're putting out their, the age of death, roughly their age of death, just kind of for funsies at their end there. So, and most of them have been dying at, the late 40s, early 50s. Today we actually get this guy we actually get who died at 68 because he sided with the correct people, and that is Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon. He was obviously famous for only having one eye.
But he had the one eye, but he didn't lose it doing something like epic. He actually lost it as a kid to smallpox, which was something he apparently found really embarrassing because any of the portraits and things he had painted of himself, he definitely had two eyes in them. But anime went, but that's cool though! Like,
eye patch!
So they kept it there.
Yeah.
And he was also unusually permissive of Christians and Christian missionaries in an era in which they were officially persecuted by the Japanese government. In his later years, he even had a ship built and funded an expedition that enabled a group of Japanese Christians to visit the Pope in Rome.
So, also fun fact, some of those Japanese pilgrims got off the boat in Spain and stayed there. So what I'm saying is, if you are trying to write a historical novel and you really need ninjas in 1600 Spain.
Totally legit.
Yeah, you've got the perfect excuse. Well, anyway.
It's time for Who's That Warlord? It's Takeda Shingen!
With boobs.
With boobs, yeah.
Got something wrong there.
Yeah. Also, fun fact, so not his armor, not Takeda Shingen's armor, but his son's armor is in the Tower of London, where it's been since the early 1600s. So what I'm trying to say here is like, Spanish ninja, Tower of London, heist movie, Hollywood, you're welcome. Also not pictured as me flailing as I take these pictures.
Get Lupin on that.
All right, so up after this, we get to the three guys who won the Japanese Game of Thrones.
Okay, the ones you've probably heard of.
Yeah, and that is Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Before we get underway here, I gotta hop up my little history nerd soapbox here for just a minute. And just remind you all that these are all real people. I know I've been using a little animated examples, but these were all real dudes. And by the standards of 2021, they were not good people. So like Oda Nobunaga here had his brother killed in order to become head of his clan. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had no children, and then so he named his nephew as his heir. And then eventually, when he did have a kid, and the nephew was now in the way of his son's succession, he forces his nephew to commit suicide, and then kills his nephew's entire family. And then Tokugawa Ieyasu has his wife and eldest son executed in order to appease Nobunaga. All of them embarked on bloody campaigns that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers and uncountable numbers of civilians, not in the name of, say, national defense or ideology or even religion, but primarily for their own wealth and power. Now, there's a very good argument to be said that these are the kind of men who are needed to put an end to the fighting and turn Japan into the safe and prosperous nation it is today. So they are indeed, in terms of history, great men. However, just keep in mind that their successes and accomplishments were built upon the backs of a tremendous amount of human suffering. So, with that onwards, I'm getting off my soapbox and we're back to the fun anime crap. So, moving on. But yeah, anyway, this is all official art, by the way. So this is Nintendo going, great role models for children. Yay! So first up, we have the guy you've probably heard of, and that is Oda Nobunaga. He was the second son of a very minor lord he was the guy who started the ball rolling on reunification by seizing control of much of the main Japanese island of Honshu. His crowning achievement probably was when he seized the city of Kyoto in 1568 and set up the very last of the Ashikaga shoguns as his puppet, and then later, when the said puppet displeased him, had him deposed. To kind of give the extent of his accomplishments here, so here's two maps here. So here's 1568, Oda territory is that tiny little red dot. And then at the time of his death in 1582, Oda territory has expanded considerably. Kind of give you also an idea of like what kind of like geographically that accomplishment was. Here is Japan overlaid with the United States. So he conquered the equivalent of North Texas, Oklahoma, and a very large chunk of Arkansas. Also, just kind of a totally random aside. This map comparing the United States to Japan is actually courtesy of the CIA's website. So, thanks. Yeah, they have lots of cool stuff on there. So, moving on. So, the question is, though, so how did Oda Nobunaga, why was he the one to succeed in reunifying very large parts of Japan? First of all, credit where credit is due. He was a good general. At one of his early battles, he managed to fend off an attacking force of 25,000 men with only 2,000 to 3,000 of his own. So he was good at it. He had some very skilled subordinates as well. And he also was, happened to be very lucky in that his allies never united against him. It's often been said that if Takeda Shingen and Uesugi Kenshin had put aside their differences and united, they would have been able to defeat him. However, they did not, and they both also conveniently died. Takeda Shingen went first. I can't remember what killed him, but when he did pass, it left his domain in the hands of his vastly less competent son. And then Uesugi Kenshin, right before he and Nobunaga were going to start campaigning against each other, just straight up just died. Just like super suddenly, to the point where his advisors were like, was this an assassination? It was like, no, this was just esophageal or stomach cancer brought about by years of hard drinking. So that's how a bit of sake, changed the course of Japanese history. Anyway, also contributing to Nobunaga's successes, that he was a very early proponent of firearms, which I mentioned arrived with the Portuguese in 1542. Basically, literally the first interaction between the Japanese and the Portuguese was like, those look cool, these are called guns. Would you like some? Yes. And within 6 months, the Japanese were manufacturing guns of their own. Nobunaga saw the value of firearms, and he had his troops train with them and drill with them, and had ammunition and gunpowder components imported, and so things like that. And if you're wondering, why are guns so good? Well, you can put a musket ball through a set of armor at about twice the distance of a bow and arrow. Guns were so effective and were so rapidly adopted that, I'm trying to remember, so the Battle of Sekigahara, which was fought in 1600, so maybe like 60 years after guns arrived in Japan, it was 80% firearms, 20% bows and arrows, like that quickly of an adoption. Anyway, also, attributing to Nobunaga's successes, he was, as I noted earlier, not particularly worried about collateral damage or crushing his enemies. Or kind of give an anecdote here. At one point, he's facing off against a group of very heavily armed monks who are on top of a mountain, and try as he might, he could not dislodge them. So he had his army surround said mountain and set fire to the forest. Fire burns up the mountain. Monks burn down, also burning down all the villages on the mountain. Thousands of people dead.
Yay!
And let's see. Oh yeah, he was also responsible for some economic reforms, and of course, a good economy feeds the engines of war, and so on like that. So what happened to Oda Nobunaga? Well, one day he decides to stop for a tea ceremony at a temple, Honnoji, and there he is betrayed by one of his own generals, a fellow by the name of Akechi Mitsuhide. There depicted with the white hair, looking very villainous.
Yep. And so this, in fact, was the place of his death, but it was pretty freaking epic. So he committed seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, as the temple burned down around him. He's like, nah, man, screw it. As for
pretty much the most metal death you can possibly
Yeah, he was
imagine.
very metal.
As for Mitsuhide, he declared himself the new ruler of Nobunaga's territories and lasted for like 2 days before Nobunaga was avenged by the next unifier on our list.
And that is Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So Toyotomi Hideyoshi was one of those rare historical figures where you're like, this guy has main character powers.
Yep.
He was born a peasant. He was the son of a foot soldier. When he died, his official title was Imperial Regent, and he was the unquestioned ruler of Japan. When he joined Nobunaga's army, it was as Nobunaga's sandal bearer, like the guy who carries Nobunaga's shoes. Okay? He was the brains of the operation. He was great at tactics. He was great at making allies. He was great at figuring out what enemies are going to do. He was an expert siege breaker. This is smart dude, right? And pretty shortly, after taking control of Nobunaga's territories, he manages to basically conquer the rest of the mainland of Japan. So now he has a large swath of territory that he controls, but everybody's used to making war on each other at the drop of a hat. So how do you stop what is now at this point well over 100 years of civil war? How do you prevent this from flaring up again? And that is to institute reforms, which is the next time I get to talk. Oh no, I'll hold that for a second. So there's a couple ways he's going to. Essentially, his idea was to make war hard. Make war hard. Make it hard to do war, right? So number one, disarmament. So there were policies in place to round up all of the swords and weaponry that belonged to the peasants. So if you were a lord and you decided, you know what, I would like to take over my neighbor's lands, it's going to be BYO, or it used to be BYOW. Bring your own weapon. Now you're going to have to supply those weapons, so it's going to be harder and more expensive and time-consuming to make war, right? Number two, I get to talk about tax policy again. So he has a census taken, figures out productive capacity of all the agricultural land, and assesses taxes that have to be paid in rice. Now, think about rice taxes, right? So you have to send, if you're a lord, you have to send away the excess food to the central government, meaning there's less food on hand for you to, say, feed your own armies, right? War is hard. Meanwhile, the central government has all this income in the form of rice, so they can sell that and make money, or they can use it to feed their own army. So now the central government is stronger. So we're altering the power balance here, right? Number three is a solidification of the societal class structure. Essentially, Toyotomi Hideyoshi does not want anyone else to do what he did. Wars are usually great for social mobility. You could prove yourself and rise up from being, garbage to being super awesome. And so people are incentivized to fight because they believe they can get ahead in life. Take that away from everybody, right? You can't rise above your social class. A lot of times men are restricted to the professions of their father. There are restrictions on, where you can travel and so on like that. So lock society into place. And the fourth major reform here is that he defamed the samurai. So before this, the samurai are landed. If they serve their lords well, they are given more land and rewards, right? So he wants to break this connection, this land-based connection between their lords and their samurai. So he presents the samurai a choice. This choice is twofold. Choice number one is that you get to keep your swords, but you have to give up your lands. You are still going to remain, you're going to join this new social class called samurai, right? Which comes with certain rights and privileges, but you can't have land. But you get to keep your weapons, so you get to be kind of like autonomous. It's pretty cool, being a samurai. Option number two is that you get to keep your lands, but you have to give up your sword as part of this, disarmament. And you are now, in terms of class, a peasant. Life sucks for peasants. No one wants to be peasants if you're offered the opportunity to change. So most of the samurai agreed to give up their lands and remain samurai. And thus this connection between, the Lord saying, well, y'all live on my land, you gotta fight for me, is now broken. So, anyway, so what happens to Toyotomi Hideyoshi? What happens to this really smart dude? Why didn't he go down as the next great dynasty?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Sorry. He had two massive weaknesses. The first was that he had way too much ambition, and the second was an incapacitating lack of children, and therefore heirs.
Yeah. So he's a smart dude, right? And he sees how well that he conquered Japan, and he's like, you know what's next, y'all? World domination, right? So conquering the world means conquering China. Conquering China means you first got to conquer Korea. So it's time for Japan to invade Korea. And they do, and there's some early Japanese success. They managed to capture the city of Seoul, for instance, but supply lines are long, their navy is crap, and eventually the campaign just kind of falls apart, which weakens Hideyoshi and his allies considerably. And then on top of that, he starts dying. I don't remember what he died of, but he had a long enough time that he could tell that he was going, right? The problem is he has exactly one child, one son, who is 5 years old. This is not someone who can hold together his father's empire. And again, because he's a peasant stock, it's not like he has a powerful family to back him either. So what he does is he calls together the 5 most powerful daimyo, and he says, this is my son. He is your rightful ruler. You will all promise me to support him and support him as your rightful ruler, and you won't. Whatever you won't do, you will not take Japan for yourselves.
And they
right?
were, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, of course. And so you can imagine this promise lasted just about as long as it took for Hideyoshi's corpse to cool. And then, you know what? Everybody's back to fighting again. Civil War's back on, y'all. Yay. And eventually, it does get wrapped up again, and we get to our ultimate victor, and that is Tokugawa Ieyasu.
The guy who won.
The guy who's won. And his anime abs of steel. Not the guy in the middle, but definitely the guy on the end, and maybe the guy on
some
closer
armored
into.
crop tops is really stylish.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I guess, the equivalent of a chainmail bikini, I guess.
Yeah.
So anyway, I know Game of Thrones references are kind of old hat these days, but this guy, to kind of sum up his personality, he is the Tywin Lannister of the Sengoku Jidai. He is smart, he is practical, he is ruthless, he is devoted to the advancement of his own family. He had kind of a terrifying childhood. He was a political hostage. Essentially, his father would send him around to various lords with the idea that, if his father breaks an alliance, said former ally gets to his son. So you can imagine what kind of growing up in that environment would do to you. Though hence probably the whole scary personality thing. Anyway, where are they? Anyway, so he was one of Nobunaga's early supporters and one of his main generals. When Nobunaga died, he and Toyotomi Hideyoshi worked out an arrangement between the two of them that Hideyoshi was going to be the new boss and Ieyasu would support him. But Ieyasu is very much, but in terms for like a lot of different concessions, for example, he never had to supply troops to Korea, meaning while Toyotomi is alive, he was very much the number 2 guy, and once Toyotomi passed away, or Hideyoshi passed away, Tokugawa Ieyasu was very much the number 1 most powerful dude. Anyway, so the grand finale of the Sengoku Jidai came in the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, where the Tokugawa-affiliated Eastern Army defeated the Toyotomi-affiliated Western Army. And this was a colossal battle. We're talking 160,000 participants. Like in history, we throw around numbers sometimes, and you're like, I don't really know. How much is 160,000 people? Best way to think about it is, has anyone ever seen the Red River Rivalry football game? University of Texas versus University of Oklahoma. Every year up in Cotton Bowl Stadium in Dallas, right? So stadium is split straight down the center. One half wearing burnt orange, the other half wearing garbage. So imagine those two halves of the football stadium trying to kill each other, right? No, imagine that times 2. That's roughly 160,000 people. That's what it looks like. So this is a gigantic battle. As I mentioned, ended with the Tokugawa victory. If you want to see an anime example of the Battle of Sekigahara, the anime Drifters opens first minute of episode 1 with this battle.
Cool. Now, the losers eventually, many years later, got the last laugh because a number of the defeated clans helped take down the Tokugawa shogunate 250 years later during the Meiji Restoration.
So basically, revenge is a dish served very cold. So, what happened to Tokugawa Ieyasu? So, he becomes shogun. Nobunaga never became shogun for whatever reason. Toyotomi Hideyoshi couldn't become shogun because he was a peasant, but Ieyasu is of very good noble blood, and so he becomes shogun. And he's shogun for like 2-3 years, something like that, before he immediately retires in favor of his own son, right? So like, why the hell would you, go through all that effort to just like give it all up? Well, because Ieyasu has read all the books, and he's seen all the movies, and he knows how this story goes. So by retiring like this, it allows his son spend enough time to become the true ruler. Meanwhile, while Ieyasu kind of lurks in the background, and everybody knows that if they cross Tokugawa Jr., they're gonna have to deal with Daddy. Nobody wants to deal with Daddy. He's a scary man. Though before he does die, he gives his son one final gift, and that is the siege of Osaka Castle. Now, remember I talked about the son of Hideyoshi, the 5-year-old, right, who oaths were sworn to, who some people could say is technically the rightful ruler, right? Him, yeah? Or at least you could, use him, make use of him as a political figurehead if you were, say, trying to foment a rebellion or whatever. So he's still out there, right? And Ieyasu doesn't like leaving these plot threads hanging. So lays siege to the castle, castle falls, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and his mother commit suicide, and because Ieyasu is a cold cucumber, he has Hideyori's infant son executed. So with that, that ends the Sengoku Jidai. There will be no sequel, and the Tokugawa will rule Japan for somewhere around 260 odd years.
Since he had 11 sons and 4 daughters.
Yeah, he had like 11 children, 15 kids, so yeah, he didn't have to worry about succession. So that brings us to our anime recommendation, which is a completely historically not accurate anime, but it is boatloads of fun, and that is Sengoku Basara, which is based off a fighting game, and it's just kind of like maximizes ridiculousness. So, unfortunately, I can't point at the screen from this angle, but kind of the guy with the hand out, so that is their version of Oda Nobunaga, who is voiced by Norio Wakamoto, who Wakamoto's as hard as he can Wakamoto, and drinks wine out of a human skull.
As one does.
That's what it does. And then next up with the scythe there, that's Akechi Mitsuhide, who runs around with, giant Grim Reaper scythe, being as extra as possible.
Sure.
Next guy down in the red armor, that's Nobunaga's brother-in-law. You don't need to know anything about him. And then the guy after that in blue, that's Date Masamune.
He rides his horse with no handlebars.
His horse has exhaust pipes, y'all. And he fights with 6 swords in his hands like Wolverine claws. And then with the furry hat, that's Takeda Shingen, who is very large and very loud, and at one point rides a horse vertically up a castle wall.
Physics with like a word.
Yeah, physics, yeah, and it's so historically accurate. And then the last guy in the red there, that's Sanada Yukimura, who is allergic to wearing shirts. So it's just basically crazy, stupid fun. Please don't learn any history from it, though. At the end, please. Which brings us to our next chapter.
Chapter 5, the Edo Period.
The Edo Period, also called the Tokugawa Period. running from 1603 to 1868. The capital moved to what is now modern-day Tokyo. Moved to Edo, which is modern-day Kyoto. I can't talk right now. It is moved to Tokyo. There we go. Tokyo. That's a word. That's a word that I know. It remained very much a feudal society with the shogun in control and various levels of nobility below him, controlling different territories. A notable feature of the Edo period was foreign isolationism. Very early on, foreign contact was basically cut off. Foreign trade was not permitted except with the Dutch and one small island. Visitors from overseas were not permitted entry, and Japanese people were not allowed to travel overseas either. So Japan became a very isolated country, which allowed its culture to kind of move in different ways than a lot of its neighbors. A strict social hierarchy was enforced in terms of who's above whom in society. Rulers are on top, of course, because they ruled. Samurai are on below them, who are very important because they fought. Peasants are below them because they created important things like food. Craftspeople are below peasants because they make important things, but as things that are not as important as food. And merchants are below them because merchants produce nothing and are therefore parasites. Very wealthy parasites, but parasites nonetheless. And actors are even below that. Yes. So
That's what my dad always said.
So anyway, it was also a period of heavy urbanization. Tokyo became, I think, the largest city in the world during this era. There was a great flourishing in the economy and arts and entertainment, and a lot of things we think of like traditional Japanese things developed during this period. In terms of fashion, so I love this slide here because it's just like a little snapshot of Edo period fashion. So there were advancements to textiles and in terms of dyeing and printing techniques, which allowed for much more colorful patterns and so forth. Women's sleeves got wider, their belts got thicker, and they tended to make really elaborate knots in the back.
Somewhat impractical, but not any different really than hoop skirts.
Yeah. And then hair is worn up and pinned. There are laws in the books that decree who is allowed to wear certain colors and things. Merchants, since they are the scum of the earth, are only allowed to wear boring colors. So you can tell immediately in this picture that the guy who's carrying those baskets there must be a merchant because he's wearing boring colors. Though they got around this by having very brilliantly covered, rich merchants got around this by having brilliantly covered kimono linings. It was the same way in some European societies too, that you get away with it by having the inside of your clothes be awesome. Also, only samurai the social class of samurai is permitted to carry swords. So if you see a guy with a sword, like that guy in the middle there, 100% certain he's a samurai because otherwise it wasn't allowed. So to continue on about talking about samurai, again, they were a social class. It was a hereditary class. So you could have samurai who were, you'd have samurai who made a living through violence or guarding things, but you also had samurai who were bureaucrats or craftspeople. It was a social class. And again, a lot of them carried swords even if they didn't use them because it was just a marker of said class. It was a proof that I am better than you, essentially. And of course, being a samurai also came with some rights and privileges that the peasants wouldn't get. For instance, a samurai could technically kill any peasant who dissed him. How often that right was actually exercised, no one is particularly sure. Probably not very often, but the fact that you could, kind of says how much above the peasant class samurai were. They were somewhere around 5 to 6% of the population. Most of them in cities because again they weren't landed anymore. I guess that's it because they weren't landed anymore. So as mentioned, it was a period of flourishing arts and culture. You had a revival of Confucian philosophy. You did have a study of science through imported books from the Dutch. And of course the arts, the hangei and ukiyo-e prints, kabuki plays, bunraku puppets, textiles with lots of cool patterns. Haiku were invented during this time period or became popular, and calligraphy and a whole bunch of other things. So kind of to go with the theme of arts here. Hands up if you've seen this picture.
Yeah.
Right? That's almost all of y'all, right? So, which is pretty amazing considering that this piece of art was created during the period in which Japan was isolated. So it's kind of amazing. So this particular piece of artwork is The Great Wave off Kanagawa by the artist Hokusai, right? So that brings us to our anime recommendation, which is Miss Hokusai, which is a film about his daughter. And it's just kind of like a slice of life. It's gorgeously animated movie. Just kind of slice of life, just kind of the lives of working artists. You know, they're working to make a living in the Edo period. And just kind of they're kind of how they make their way through life. It is, yeah, I just highly recommend it. It's just, because a lot of anime is based, again, on men waving swords at each other. So sometimes it's just interesting to see, like, you know, what people were up to who weren't farmers or rulers or warriors, just like your everyday folk. So that's my anime recommendation for the period. And now we get to move on and talk about a country we have not yet mentioned, and that country is America! Okay, so United States of America. So, let me set the picture for y'all. So, hot off achieving manifest destiny and expanding our territory from sea to shining sea, the United States looks to the Pacific, right? So, while we've been busy conquering the West, what have the other Western powers been up to? I see. This thing called colonialism.
Sounds neat.
So, you go into another country, you take over their government, exploit the people, steal their resources. We've got a lot of experience in that. We should do some too, right? So the problem, though, is that you know, the U.S. is late to the party, and the Pacific sphere has already been pretty well carved up by the other Western powers. You've got the British in China, you've got the Dutch in Indonesia, you got the Spanish in the Philippines, you got the French in Vietnam. Like, what's up? What's left for the United States? Who do we get to, you know, exploit? But there's this country called Japan, and they don't trade with anybody, which is, like, frankly, an insult to capitalism. Like no, like that can't be. That's just not. That's
illegal.
That's, yeah. So the United States decides that we got to do something about this, right? This is just no. So they appoint Commodore Matthew Perry to go and visit the United States, or visit Japan on behalf of the United States and make them trade with us. And we also need a port to refuel our whaling ships, so that's very important too. So Commodore Perry sails not out of, say, like California or something, but he sails out of Virginia. And he sails across the Atlantic Ocean, and he sails across the Indian Ocean, and eventually, after a very long time, he reaches Japan. And there he takes his time, sailing very slowly up the coast, firing his cannons for target practice whenever he can, so everyone can see him coming. And by the time he sails up to Edo, everyone, the shogunate is basically just like, okay, oh God. So once he is there, Commodore Perry kind of takes this carrot and the stick approach, right? So he's like, here's all the cool stuff you could have Japan if you traded with us. So he's got, like, you know, trade goods. He's got an entire miniature railway. He's got a working telegraph. He's got books of science. Look at all this cool stuff. And then there's also, like, you know, look at those pretty, you know, big old scary ships in your harbor. And you've got a lovely country here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it.
Well, the gift baskets he gave to some of the nobles were pretty rad. He gave some examples of the finest things that America had to offer at the time. A clock, a sword, pretty cool, 2 guns,
Not one but 2,
and 5 gallons of whiskey.
America! Yeah, so anyway, he leaves for a while and he comes back, but whatever. But eventually he gets that trade treaty, and Japan it's a very unequal trade treaty, I might add, but Japan is now going to trade with the United States. And then the rest of the Western powers are like, us too, yeah. And suddenly Japan is trading with everybody, and their period of isolationism comes to an end. So we have to talk about this guy.
You might think we mentioned Commodore Matthew Perry. This is not actually Commodore Matthew Perry.
I'm sorry.
This is Captain Matthew Perry in anime form, because apparently the Commodore was too old to be Shifai. So
this is Captain Matthew Perry, his son, who had absolutely nothing at all to do with Japan.
Right.
He fought in the Mexican War, and then a couple hundred years later, this happens to him.
But those thigh highs.
I just love the skirt. Like, that is like the most American skirt.
It's very good.
It's amazing. So anyway, that brings us to this end of the isolation and brings us to our 15?
Yes.
Okay, brings us to the Bakumatsu.
Yeah, chapter 6. The
Bakumatsu, which is another period that anime really likes. So we are going to cover that in a bit more detail. I gotta hurry now because we are running late. Okay, so the Bakumatsu translates to literally the end of the Bakufu, the end of this tent government. It is better thought of as the end of the shogunate. So the concessions to Western powers made the shogun look really bad. Like, you know, it's hard to be a barbarian doing generalissimo when the barbarians are inside your house, you know, taking your stuff. So they look really weak. There's other social problems going on. Urbanization is putting pressure on peasants and agriculture. The merchants are wealthy, but they have no political influence, and so they're super unhappy. Nobles owe debts to the merchants, which is kind of upsetting everything. There are economic shifts, like opening to trade caused the economy to crash because some goods are now like, you know, because the Industrial Revolution has happened elsewhere in the world. So, you know, textiles are now super cheap. So if you were like, say, a weaver or something, you're like basically out of a job. Like, so there's a huge like turmoil in the economy. So basically everybody is super unhappy with the shogun. The shogun tried to make some concessions to his daimyo, like allowing them to build up their own military, which is, as history might show you, is kind of a bad thing. So eventually the whole thing explodes into a civil conflict and results in eventually the resignation of the last of the Tokugawa shogun in 1568. Direct rule by the emperor is restored, and political reformation begins. So going into a little bit more detail, so the conflict here is the pro-imperial forces versus the pro-Bakufu forces. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarian is the motto of the Shishi, the anti-shogunate forces. The Bakufu is opposed, or the shogunate is opposed most prominently by the Chosu and Satsuma domains, who, as noted, were defeated in the Battle of Sekigahara, so here them coming back. The pro-imperial forces seized Edo, Kyoto, Osaka, and the Tokugawa loyalists were mopped up in the Boshin War, which ended in 1869. So, since we are talking about the Bakumatsu, there is a group we have to talk about because they feature in every anime that talks about the Bakumatsu, and that is the Shinsengumi. So, grand thing, basically the thing you need to know about the Shinsengumi IRL is that they weren't that important IRL. A lot of them died young. So presumably they died handsome, and there's kind of this whole like lost cause romanticism thing going on. It's called Last of the Samurai thing, so they are like way blown out of proportion to what they really were, right? There are maybe only like 400 of them like ever at any point.
Also, fun fact, those blue Haori coats that they wear, or the happy coats, yeah, no, Haori, I said it right. Anyway, with the white markings on the sleeves, were a uniform that they wore, but the thing is they only wore that particular uniform for about 1 year.
Yeah, so that's why they're depicted, and they didn't actually wear that. Anyway, they were a semi-sanctioned group of pro-shogunate samurai who were guarding the city of Kyoto. Their kind of crowning achievement was when the Ikadai incident, in which the Shinsengumi broke up a pro-imperial cell that was planning on setting fire to the city of Kyoto and kidnapping the emperor. But anyway, so fun fact is that since this is the 1860s now, we have this thing called photography, meaning we know what these guys actually look like. This is not what they look like. Spoiler alert.
Ready to have your vision and dreams shattered? So here we have three pretty prominent Shinsengumi members depicted in the Otome game Hakuoki, which also has a lot of anime versions. First we have Vice Commander Hijikata Toshizo, and then Commander Kondo Isami, and then third unit commander Saito Hajime.
So y'all ready to see what they actually look like? Can
Yeah,
you drum roll?
yeah, drum roll, drum roll, drum roll, drum roll.
And
yeah.
oh, sorry, there they are. Just three dudes.
They are three guys.
Yeah.
Three guys.
Apologies to Hajime Saito. That's him when he's like 50 or something. So he presumably had more hair when he was young and doing his cool Shinsengumi thing. But
kudos to the Token Rambu anime, which actually tried for a little bit of realism, and they somehow bishified the photograph. So like
extra bonus point. Which leads us to our anime recommendations, and I actually have two because I couldn't figure out which one I wanted to do. So first up, we get Peacemaker Kurogane, which is about a boy who joins the Shinsengumi in order to avenge his dead father. I recommend it. Of course, the downside is it's got an extremely loud, screamy, early 2000s protagonist. That is the downside. The upside, though, is that it is kind of fascinating that it is one of the very few shonen anime that I've ever seen that is about normal humans with no powers or anything killing other normal humans with no other powers or anything. It's a shonen anime, right? And it's like it treats that part of its premise with respect. It recognizes that it is about killing people. At one point or other, our very loud protagonist gets a man killed because he's part of an undercover operation, drops a name where he shouldn't drop a name, and the Shinsengumi member he's with is like, well, gotta kill the witness now. It gets really dark. And also the sword play is actually really good for an early 2000s anime. It's actually animated as sword fights instead of just being whoosh, attack name, whoosh, So I highly recommend it. The other recommendation is Hakuoki, which is way more on the nonsense side of things because there's lots of vampires involved, and it's yay. Anyway, it's about a girl who disguises herself as a boy to join the Sengoku to look for her missing father.
And it's a lot of pretty boys.
It's a lot of pretty boys. There is an anime adaptation. I've not seen enough episodes to render judgment. However, I'm here to advocate for the Otome game it is based on, which is very pretty and chock full of fun history things behind all the vampires. It's also been out in English for a long time, and it's also a good localization. It wasn't just run through Google Translate or whatever. It's been out on a bajillion platforms, everything from the PSP to PC version. I would actually recommend the PC version. You can get it on Steam. I think it's broken into 2 parts, about $10 each. Highly recommend it. It's a great Otome game. So, moving on. We get to the Meiji Era, which is 1868 to 1912. Edo is renamed to Tokyo and becomes the Imperial Court. The Imperial Court is finally lifted out of Kyoto and plonked down in Tokyo. There is a movement towards westernization. The country begins just trying to modernize at warp speed because they realize how far behind the rest of the world they are and they think that they're going to catch up. It also results in a lot of military buildup and a lot of expansionist policies, resulting in wars against China, Korea, and the annexation of Taiwan, wars against Russia and China and the annexation of Taiwan and Korea and other territories. And just letting you know that going forward here, so it's responsible for, going forward here, we're going into a period of Japanese history which has resulted in a lot of bad blood between them and elsewhere in Asia because they were not beneficent overlords. We'll just call it that. So, moving on, we're going to our final chapter.
Chapter 7, the 20th century.
We got 8 minutes. All right, 8 minutes to cover 100 years. All right, so next up we get the Taisho Era. Japan sides again with the Allied forces in World War I, joins League of Nations. There's a movement towards democratization. Men over 25 get the vote. There's also the Great Kanto earthquake. Around 100,000 people get killed. Much of Tokyo and Yokohama are destroyed. There are also a hugely disproportionate number of anime set in the Taisho period, despite how being only 14 years. Because it's great for setting a time period, because it's after the Meiji Meiji period, so you have things like telephones and cars and elevators, but it's before the scary war buildup, so it's a good place to plonk it. So, next up, World War II, Showa Era, Part 1. If you all haven't learned about World War II in your history class, please go punch your teachers. I'm not going to go into it. I think you guys know what happened. Just want to know that. So Japan was not seized controls of large parts of Asia, including China, and they were, again, not beneficent overlords. Lots of forced labor, lots of massacres, lots of 100,000 women forced in sexual slavery, that kind of thing. So, anyway, moving on. So, war, of course, ends with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States, and the Allied forces, particularly the United States, occupying in its post-war period. All right, next up, we get Showa Era Part 2. So, after the war, Japan rebuilds its economy, starts making everything. It makes everything from steel to electronics to cars. They became a huge manufacturing hub, this great manufacturing miracle, and for our purposes, they also start making anime. So, hooray! Yay! All right, and next up we get the Heisei Era from 1989 to 2019, the economic bursts, resulting in this lost generation where you kind of get deflationary prices, a stagnant GDP, and just kind of people kind of missing out on prosperity, and just kind of the Japanese economy has never really picked up from this.
Like right now.
Exactly. There's also demographic shifts, the population starts aging, and actually the population as a whole starts shrinking. And the era ended in April 2019 with the emperor's retirement. And in case you're wondering, the current emperor is the 126th emperor, under the official accounting going back to 2,600 years. So, before we go to our next slide, so our last time we gave this particular panel was in February 2020. And at the time, I just kind of had a question marks on the next slide here, because who can know, whether an event is historically significant or not? So I think it's safe to say that we can put the COVID-19 pandemic as one of the important events of the Reiwa era. And as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, Tokyo hosted the Olympics, but they didn't have any spectators, alas. Which brings us to our anime recommendations. Again, I have two. The first one is In This Corner of the World, which is a movie. It is about a girl who enters into a relatively happy arranged marriage in the pre-war era, pre-World War II era. The first half is kind of very slice of lifey as she gets to know her new in-laws, and then the second half is like life on the Japanese home front during World War II with all the rationing and air raids, and let's just put it this way, the girl is from Hiroshima, so you can take a pretty good stab at how this ends. But I highly recommend it. It's absolutely gorgeous. I'm not going to spoil anything, but you can guess. But it is absolutely gorgeously animated, just super beautiful. I think you can get it on Netflix, but it's well worth watching. And our second recommendation, because I could not decide, is Kids on the Slope, which is it's set in the 1960s. It's a lovely coming-of-age story about a boy who joins a jazz band, and just talks a lot about the contemporary events of that time, from student protests to the lingering effects of American forces being stationed in Japan. So, and it has the musical performances, the jazz performances are just godly. They rotoscoped everything, so it looks like they're actually playing their instruments. It's amazing. And the music is just fantastic. Highly recommend this series. So with that, we come to the future here. Everything I had on that slide was kind of bunk. Also, fun fact that Akira actually takes place in the distant cyberpunk year of 2019. I know. So it also managed to predict the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, and it also managed to predict those Olympics would be delayed by an epidemic, meaning we should probably use it as prophecy. So I'll stand up here and make a prediction that Tokyo is going to be overrun by psychics and biker gangs in the near future, which leads us to the end. So again, we have up here our little anime recommendation cards if any of you wants any. And then if you want to follow us, I'm old, so I don't do social media, but Marianne here has a Twitter account.